The next Philosophy Portal course focuses on the concept and the tradition of Christian atheism. The course starts October 20th, and more information can be found at philosophyportal.online. Throughout the course, we will be developing themes of modern philosophy in relationship to the project of Christian atheism, including German idealism, Hegelo-Marxism, Nietzsche and psychoanalysis, Althusser's gospel, Zizek's philosophy, and Rollins' theology. The course will also feature guest lectures from Slavoj Žižek, Peter Rollins, and Barry Taylor. To learn more, visit philosophyportal.online. All right, welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name's Cadell Last, and I'm here today with Helen Rollins. Helen has been a friend of the portal. She visited the Edge very recently, and this is her first time on the Philosophical Conversation series. Helen is a writer and a filmmaker from Northern Ireland and currently based between London and Belfast. She lectures and writes across topics related to film and psychoanalysis. She has been the co-host on 2 different philosophy podcasts and has recently released a book on film theory titled Psychocinema, which is forthcoming with Polity. So maybe let's just go slowly. Helen, welcome to the channel, and tell me a little bit about why you chose the topic psychocinema, and for people who might be new to the field you're trying to explore here, what is psychocinema?
So, first of all, the title Psychocinema was given to me by my editor, Laurent de Sutter, who is just the most brilliant guy. I think he's fantastic, and he's the series editor of Theory Redux at Polity. He's a Belgian man, so English is not his first language, but he's obviously brilliantly well spoken and all this kind of stuff in English. But he was the one who came up with that title, and I can't remember what it was called originally. Maybe it was something like cinema as psychoanalysis, film as psychoanalysis, or emancipatory something rather. I don't know. It was a really shit title originally, but basically, this is a concept I guess I revolve around. I always feel sorry for the people I spend most time with, because I sort of like to go on little rants and I can't stop myself, and I sort of repeat myself a lot. And these are sort of ideas that I've repeated for a long, long time. I think basically, since not only in terms of film itself, but in terms of psychoanalysis, and I think I got into psychoanalysis via film. I got into film via something else. But it's interesting how these sort of things lead back to one another. And I got into psychoanalysis because I did a literature degree in French and Spanish, and I did a film. I was sort of quite a lazy, well, I don't know if lazy, I'm like also a bit of a workaholic, but maybe like into sort of optimizing time, whatever. Which is like maybe not a good thing to admit, I don't know. But anyway, so I realized that I could get really good at languages by watching movies. So I watched a lot of movies, and also in terms of the reading lists in a literature degree, you know, it can be like egregiously long. So films you can just watch in an hour and a half or 2 hours or whatever. And so I always had this interest in cinema, and I did do sort of had a pivot in my degree in a certain extent to like film theory in my like final year of my undergrad. And we would get these lectures on critical theory and film theory or whatever. And I would say we were obviously, you know, this is undergrad, so what are you going to do? But it was sort of taught in such a way. It didn't quite sit right to me with me at the time. Not that I like had the place to understand, but it was sort of like Freud, Lacan, Jung. You know, this sort of like psychoanalysis is all one thing, and it was in this more sort of. We were just talking before pressing record on our experiences at university, and obviously the university is a site of like the bourgeoisification of the economy, like of, you know, the neoliberal university is very different to what it used to be. And we were thinking that we were at sort of a period of time where we're maybe in the transition phase, where it felt like these institutions had resisted it for a long time, and maybe by my final year it was sort of slipping in, but in the sort of the studies version of things, instead of there being like philosophy and maybe thinking about film or certain questions to do with like identity in relation to philosophy, it was sort of like a studies thing. But you know, that wasn't the kind of degree that I did. But I was just saying that in when it came to psychoanalysis, I was like, But anyway, so I wrote around film in my final exams related to these ideas. But later on, and I had certain experiences in my life, as one does, where you sort of think, ooh, there's something psychic going on here, myself, my family milieu, the economy, or things are contradictory. You go to the end of one thing and a contradiction arises. And so these things were sort of playing out in my life where I sort of thought like psychoanalysis could be of interest to me. And I started to read independently in Freud and Lacan. And it was very much sort of like, oh, well, this isn't quite what I think some of the received wisdom in some of these studies versions of Freud and Lacan being placed upon different phenomena, including film. And it's of no surprise, of course, that film and psychoanalysis go hand in hand. If you look at like the material history of cinema and psychoanalysis, like Freud discovers the unconscious of like the 1890s or something, and the Lumiere brothers, make their first films in something like 1895. This is, psychoanalysis is dealing with the psychic symptoms that emerge as a result of the repressions of the contradictions of the capitalist economy, desire, questions of desire, fantasy, all this kind of stuff. And cinema does the same. So it's not surprising that these things kind of, are sort of phenomena that speak to each other. In a sense, desire plays out in the visual field. Cinema is not only, and it's funny, as a filmmaker, there's always this thing of like sound is more important than sight. But anyway, it's a visual medium, in terms of how we understand it. But I would say that something kind of went wrong, either in some of the readings of Lacan, especially as they were translated into film studies, or in the way that these originary texts also in film studies have been interpreted. And this is resisting the complex, contradictory, ambivalent positions that play out in the writers such as Lacan and Freud, that are nothing to do with particularism or like the closure in oneness or oneness in alterity or anything like that. And it's kind of sad, first of all, that the received wisdom, there's certain ideas that people talk about in cinema that's like, oh, the gaze, the male gaze, the female gaze, whatever. And that's attributed to Lacan, which in one sense I think is wrong, because if we understand gaze in a Lacanian sense is quite different to what's become understood in common parlance as male gaze related to film. But also, it sort of arrested this like potentiality that we actually have in terms of what a Lacanian reading of cinema might be or might have been. Because, and this is also, the capitalist economy sort of works in this way. You have, millions and millions and millions of ideas, and one takes off, and the value of that one is the sacrifice of all the other ideas. And this is the same with labor and stuff like that. So this, you have these singular ideas that are just ideas. This is not to say that like whence they generated and all this kind of stuff, or whoever created them is wrong or ethically wrong or anything like that. It's just that, there's ideas that are conducive to the non-contradictory logic of capital. Lacanian logic is actually, the analyst discourse is very different to the capitalist discourse. And first of all, by calling what's come to be known as Lacanian film studies as Lacanian, we've lost the potential contribution of this much more broad, interesting, exciting, anti-capitalist sort of set of ideas. But also, by giving it this sort of like mystified hue or scientific hue, by giving it these sort of names that are of words that are attributed like jargon, it also has really become to be a function of the mystification of the material structure of film, which I argue in the book is that of psychoanalysis. But also in terms of film production, it's really hard to articulate as a separate issue how this set of ideas has come to be the ideological foil for the really egregious material conditions that exist specifically in European media production. That's a whole other thing. So this book is trying to re-theorize or like open back up the question of what might a Lacanian contribution to cinema be. And the conclusion is that perhaps actually this is a really powerful medium, a powerful political medium, a psychoanalytic medium, as in the experience of the viewer viewing a film may be analogous, similar in many ways to that of the analysand in psychoanalysis, which is very
Great.
different to, you know, the male gaze is to do with the male's director, or things like psychoanalysis can help us see what was the hidden meaning of the film or what's going on in the mind of the director. To me, that's an approach, but it's not a Lacanian one to me. I think that's a sort of misrecognition of what psychoanalysis is as well. Like, it's not this sort of structure of the detective story where we have this hidden thing and it's excavated. It's actually all in the real world. I mean, yeah, the detective is also looking at sort of things manifest in the real world, but it's not, this sort of hidden El Dorado logic that is, if I can unearth my inner workings, then, it's all
The
happening.
meanings are on the surface,
Exactly.
not
Exactly.
hidden in the depths or something like this. I
Exactly.
mean,
Yeah.
what I'm getting from you here is that you're raising the bar for the common slang of Netflix and chill. Like when we Netflix and chill, right? We're actually engaging something very deep, very serious,
We
potentially
could
in
be.
regards
We
to
could be.
we could be.
We
There's the
could be.
potential there, and
We could
there's
be.
potentially a missed opportunity here if we
Yeah.
don't pick up Psychocinema and sort of go through
By the
the.
way,
If this book gets overlooked, then we're missing a huge opportunity here with emancipatory potential. But it's something that is definitely plugged into my intuitions, because while people will usually frame watching movies, watching Netflix, even playing video games as sort of pastimes in which we are wasting our time, or we are just sort of zoning out and zombifying ourselves in this sort of, like you said, the, let's say, late capitalist materiality. I think that in my experience, when you pay attention to a really good film, or if you pay attention to a really good series, there's huge learning opportunities here about the structure of reality, the structure of
exactly.
our psyches, the structure of the world economy and society, and even
Absolutely.
historical analysis. That these are
Absolutely.
very rich mediums, and
Exactly.
actually, if you compare these mediums to the narrative mediums that most humans had access to hundreds of years ago, we are spoiled for choice, and we are spoiled for opportunities to engage in
Yeah.
a richer, more reflective, psycho analytic process than, like I said, any of our historical contemporaries. So maybe you could piece together for the viewers, what are the stakes for emancipation and cinema? These things are not usually thought
Yeah.
together, and it's really the way you open the book here.
Yes. I mean, okay, there's loads of different ways to sort of talk about it, because I think there's, for me as a maker, there's what I see as the power of film. And unfortunately, as a maker, I mean, maybe I should go into the material conditions that we confront as artists in the 21st century, particularly in Europe, in the sort of new structure, the new turn in capitalism that has sort of emerged in relation to sort of state-sponsored corporate socialism and stuff like that. But it's very difficult to raise funds because one needs money for films. The more experience one gets, the sort of one can kind of use what one has to create an art. But it's not like writing a book. Obviously one needs leisure time to write books, but or to write books that aren't necessarily are reflective or aren't necessarily targeted towards the necessity of presenting. It's not even, I would say, an ideological position. It's a position related to desire. It's a dynamic of desire. And I would say that capitalism relies on a dynamic of desire that cinema can challenge. But it's very difficult. And I think that cinema at its best and art at its best does this. This is art, I would say, operates in something more like the analyst discourse, although the bourgeoisification of everything is trying to commodify everything and turn that ambivalence that is art insofar as it houses contradiction. And desire is contradictory. Capitalism relies on the promise of oneness in alterity. So the existential or even ontological lack we experience is contingent. I mean, you could say it's materially contingent in terms of the structure of the universe, but it is in our moment, in our present moment, in capitalist ideology, contingent. It is not lack with a capital L, it's a contingent loss that we can assuage with the purchasing of a product, with the achievement of a goal or something like that. That's capitalist logic. Obviously, it's funny because I was at a conference and I was talking about the book, and a lot of people in the audience were sort of from kind of the poetics or literature background, and this is a very different approach that I'm putting forward in the book to that take. So there's a long history of, for example, Andre Bazin and people like this, who look at the structure of art of storytelling in kind of like a more normative way, and talk about you can have a cinema of the future where it's more emancipatory. The more real it is, the more. And it is true, as you point out, that like one way we can read films in an emancipatory way is to have a good Marxist or Hegelian take on what is presented to us, and the kind of films that are made say something about our society, or the stuff we discuss says something about our society. But I actually think the structure of film can do something to can explore and explode our capitalist mode of desire in the same way that psychoanalysis does. But historically it's been like, oh, plot is this meta narratives are bad and Hollywood cinema's bad because it's like totalizing. But again, as we know, if we've read McGowan or Adorno, McGowan critiques Adorno, but like what is declarative as totality in capitalism is the sniff precise opposite, right? So capitalism claims to put forward universals, but it always relies on an exclusion. Not only that there must always be an excluded subject, but there must always be a new resource that can be mined that is ontologically different, that's transcendentally different, that can assuage the gap of lack. So the totality is never that. It is absolutely never that. The problem with capitalism is it's not total enough. It doesn't take into consideration the lack at the heart of the universe. But psychoanalysis, so there is this sort of idea that like, oh, the totalizing thing's bad. And you have sort of like 20th century traditions in critique of capitalism where it's like, but it's actually, a lot of these critiques aren't, I would argue, critiquing capitalism or bourgeois society. They're critiquing the enemy of bourgeois society, which is something more antique than that. But that's a whole other story. But that's also the enemy of the proletariat, but that's a whole other question. But so just to talk about desire. So psychoanalysis works via transference. So transference is the way in which the subject libidinally invests in the supposed knowledge of the practitioner. And this is also a sort of a fact of like a lot of psychoanalysts, practicing psychoanalysts, aren't really public online because it would destroy their whole profession. They rely on a misguided image on the part of the analyst, which always you cannot logic your way to the cure. This is also why I consciousness raising doesn't work. We have this is the art of unconsciousness raising. And there's that term I borrowed from Carlos Padron, who's a psychoanalyst in New York, great guy. Anyway, so thanks, Carlos. Good term that I used. Anyway, so from you. But anyway, so the individual who's suffering, psychically suffering, goes to psychoanalysis. And the only motivation to invest in it, to libidinally invest in it, to put money into it, which is a whole part of the whole investment, is to believe that the psychoanalyst has a knowledge that they will cure you. And you lie there and you don't know what they're thinking, you say, and you're waiting for them to not only know you, but know the solution to your issues. And it's only through that investment that the time investment and the investment in transference, the attenuement, the long-termism of it is important, because we can't just in the short term like explode our fantasy and have it taken away from us. This would lead us into like an egregious sort of exposure to the real. It would be horrendous, and this is maybe one of the issues with film is it's too short, but we could argue it's a small dose. But like psychoanalysis relies on the transference and the gradual letting down. As you gradually witness over the years, your psychoanalyst says something totally irrelevant and you think like, what the fuck? have they been listening any of this time? So, but you're gradually let down, and then you actually come to realize that the other exists, and in their existence they are divided. So we talked about this on The Edge the other day in terms of what recognition actually is. It is misrecognition, and you can only be recognized, quote unquote, insofar as the other is a divided subject like you and might get you wrong. This is how, thought and discernment are actually sort of a possibility. But so I argue that film, and this is just my opinion, this is not to say I love, video art, I love more poetic films, I love, all these kinds of things. But the thing is, and we talk about this a lot in terms of only a Christian can be an atheist. You've got to go through the door, go the whole way, and then you realize the dark heart at the center of everything.
The dark heart of God.
Exactly. So the viewer, buys in terms of film. You do transference with the characters. You do transference with the plot. You invest on an unconscious libidinal level, being like, oh my God, I'm going to be fulfilled. I'm going to find this out. And actually, the films that stand the test of time are the ones actually that confront ourselves with the contradictions of desire. And they're so powerful because we've invested in them, believing that this art form is in this hour and a half experience via the characters, that we invest in. We're going to be assuaged in our desire for wholeness. And actually, because it mobilizes desire, and because of things like, plot, which is riven and twisty and turny, it's like I talk about it being like the Fort Dar game. These are like games that like children play when they're forming their subjectivity. These games of presence and absence. And plot really is like this: you have it, you don't have it; you have it, you don't have it. These are all important technologies for the human subject to come to terms with their condition. And in small doses, we could argue that cinema, in this sense, because it mobilizes desire, it can have this capacity to confront us with the structure of our desire, which is always lacking, and therefore it does not accord in its nature, in its denature, with the ideology of promise, the religious lie of capitalism.
There's a lot there. Some of the things that I want to sort of raise to the surface is kind of your way of understanding capitalism, which I think is very important, and specifically the way you're defining it in terms of promising a oneness and alterity. Of course, religion, traditionally speaking, would perform that function.
Yeah.
Religion offers a oneness and alterity, and this is one of the reasons why I often like this famous quote from Walter Benjamin, capitalism, which is pointing at capitalism as actually the location of our religion today, where, he said, God didn't die, he was turned into money.
Yeah.
And, this kind of dimension of things is super important, and it's also something that I refer to with a Hegelian slogan that you use in the book Psychocinema, which is, the secret, Hegel's saying the secrets of the ancient Egyptians were secrets for the ancient Egyptians themselves. And I say that for like the neoliberal capitalist subject. The secrets of the neoliberal capitalist subject were secrets for the neoliberal capitalist subject themselves. And specifically in regards to this dimension you bringing up with capitalism and the promise of oneness in alterity. And so what I'm getting what you're pointing towards here is that for subjects who are under this fantasy, who are under this fundamental fantasy, one way to do analysis without actually doing analysis would be to almost do like a subjective perspective shift on why I'm attracted to the films I'm attracted to, or why I'm attracted to the shows I'm attracted to. Am I searching for something in these shows, some sort of secret kernel, some sort of hidden meaning, which I'm never actually going to reach? And why am I sort of binging the shows I'm binging? Even like from a meta perspective, why are the reality TV shows that are popular, why are they popular? Is this pointing towards a kernel of some social fundamental fantasy which is captivating a certain demographic? Yeah,
Yeah.
what ideas are coming to you from
Absolutely.
this?
I mean, yeah, that's a really interesting set of ideas. I mean, I'm sure lots of people are doing work on this, but in terms of how like the binging functions and the series functions, as in you're never given the closure, right? Part of the way it keeps you going is it's like if you are given the closure, also you can read your affect in relation to often a plot is too neatly closed and it's like, oh, is that it, or you get to the end of a series and you discover who the baddie is and you're like, ugh. It's really what we, as McGowan has pointed this out so much in terms of like the sexual act, the little death, as the French tells us, is a death in the desire that happens when you actually climax, right? When you get it, you realize like, oh fuck, but the desire stops, for momentarily, or a certain form of desire stops. But and it's interesting when we talk about like reality TV, and it's interesting. There's this great Mitchell and Webb sketch about it's The Apprentice in the UK, and it's about how these TV executives coming up with a show, and it's how basically everybody who's watching it thinks that everybody else who's watching it is stupid apart from them. So you get the jouissance of imagining. It makes you feel smarter than you actually are because you imagine that there is the subject supposed. It's interesting because we talk about the subject supposed to know in psychoanalysis, and we can think about the subject supposed to in loads of different ways. This idea of the subject supposed to hate is something that comes up a lot at the moment in terms of the culture wars and the way that capitalist utopian logic relies on a scapegoat, and so there's the necessity for there to be all these hateful people, and so there are hateful people, but the subject supposed to hate often acts as the scapegoat behind whom you can imagine that the problems with capitalism are contingent. All you have to do is get rid of the hateful subject, and then you'd have a capitalism without antagonism, not realizing that it's the repressed antagonisms itself that generate the libidinal desire for the scapegoat, who casts in shadow the utopian vision, and that actually by accepting the dialectical material of reality, the fact that it is an utopian world, that we live in the grit and grime of the world, as Marx points out in the introduction to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, it's about picking the living flower. So, and when we do that, we're less likely to sort of scapegoat and stuff like that. But there was a question in there that was really interesting. Oh yeah, about religion. And obviously, there's other thinkers who talked about this. So like Nietzsche says in The Gay Science that, Buddha died and the shadow of God, I can't remember. It was cast on the cave wall for 1,000 years to come, And
Yeah, you quote this in your book as well.
like Lacan, God is unconscious, right? So this is the issue, of course, as we know from a like psychoanalytic perspective, that it's all very well to call yourself an atheist, but to consciously be atheistic. But the fact is we still have this compulsion, and Julia Kristeva talks about this in terms of the immanent transcendence of the experience of psychoanalysis, or what it is to be human, which is it's precisely because of our lacking nature, which, if you buy into psychoanalysis, comes from a material structure of the human body and the material structure of the universe.
Our primal impotence,
Our primarily our
our uh, our uncoordinated fetus body.
exactly neoteny and all this kind of stuff. Um, that impulse is there. And the thing is, with organized religion, again, this is not to. There is a tendency when one critiques neoliberalism to for it to sound like a more conservative position than it is, because obviously as humans it's easier for us to think in dualistic ways, but there is no dualism in the universe really, other than artifice. So the thing is, so this isn't to support old forms of religion, but religion, like confessional religion, does often come with theological practices, which are the practices that critique and that analyze the dynamic of religion. So, like the toxic. It's funny because, yeah, when I say religion, often I mean something other than religion, or like a feature of religion, which is the desire for oneness and alterity, like the desire for transcendence, assuagement from lack. But often you see this a lot in the Jewish tradition. You do see this in certain schools in Christianity. You see this in Buddhism. I'm not an expert by any means, but theology can be like a critique of this form of desire. And because of the confidence of our 21st century critique, we're all well educated, and it's funny, we're also talking about like one of the most rapid mechanisms of proletarianization that's taken place in the history of capitalism is the neoliberalization of the university. So via the very promise of escaping a proletarian existence, one becomes proletarianized by debt, by becoming a surplus reserve army of the surplus qualified. That's another story. But we have lost the as we've become more. There's so much about the universe that we do not understand and do not know. We know very little, but we have a confidence, especially in our atheism, that resists a criticism of, that resists criticizing the fact that we are still very, very religious. And obviously
Yeah.
capitalism relies on this idea. And, if we think about like the phenomenology of spirit, like, Hegel posits that like each form of society represses the contradiction more and more and seems more and more natural. But because, and again, like when you have a sort of confessional religion, it's the wolf in wolf's clothing. This is something you can kind of critique. And this is also, one of the factors of, feudal society or monarchies. You can actually see the issue and do something about it, but it becomes more and more and more repressed with our greater and greater capitalist freedom. And this creates huge amounts of social symptoms. One of them being the scapegoat mechanism, so culture wars, enemy making, anxiety. Well, there's various forms of anxiety, but lots of psychic suffering, inverting one's failures in relation to the capitalist economy into personal responsibility because one doesn't have a clear vision of like the political economy that has led to one's economic position. But yeah, no, and I think as you pointed out, it's not just the sort of where I end in the book, and it's sort of the kind of films that I try to make in my practice. That's maybe one way of doing it, but I think it's also enough to sort of theologize. So you can see the filmmaker could maybe think about creating a technology, like a film machine that does something with desire, that mobilizes it and confronts the viewer with it. That's like one way of doing it. There's also a sort of theologizing of desire that one can do just by like reading and analyzing films or thinking about them in different ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that one of the key things here that I'd like to bring out is the sort of false confidence of our atheism that you're emphasizing. Of course, connected to the way you're sort of provoking us with the idea that we could theologize our desires. I mean, I think that one great example of this would be like a historical analysis of the figure of Richard Dawkins, like perhaps especially at this moment,
Yeah.
in the sense that many people today are calling him Christian,
Yeah.
and this sort of shocks him.
Yeah.
Like, how could I possibly be a Christian? I've spent my entire life as the world's most famous atheist.
Yeah.
And what people are pointing out is kind of like the unconscious structure of his belief and his
Yeah.
behavior and all of these dimensions of things. And then
Yeah.
also in sort of if you study his own self-conscious professed belief about the future direction of society or the way society should be organized or run. Basically, what he expresses is a type of faith in liberal secular rationality, and behind that, kind of an implicit assumption that capitalism should take care of things with some social regulations or stuff like this. So there is a way in which we need to have a deeper understanding of atheism that takes into consideration the unconscious dimension of our mind. And I think that it was a big mistake in the early 21st century to think that we could just, through our rational, self-conscious reflection, get out of the entire history of the religious structure, And so I think that this process that you're trying to bring to our attention, specifically the structural homology between a psychoanalytic session on the one hand and psychocinema on the other hand, is yet another potential resource for us in terms of bringing psychoanalysis out of the clinic. What do you
Yeah.
think about that, of thinking
Yeah.
of psychoanalysis in a way that has perhaps
Yeah, an actual social function.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I know that like this is the nature of discourse, right? Because like also whatever takes off eventually is going to end up becoming the very thing that anything can be commoditized, right? So there is this you know okay, there is this critique which I understand, but I also think is not the total picture of the promise of anything. As in, if you say that psychoanalysis is emancipatory, that this could be a commoditized one. But we already have, that's already happened. That's like therapy culture, right? If you say that like understanding your psyche more is going to da, 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 then and this obviously is like, you know, and this is where you see this. Of course, it's interesting because like the way that like let's say liberal critique has sort of rationalized it is things like, you know, you have these terms pink washing or green washing, and again that those sort of terms, whilst I sort of think they really capture a clear reality, it's sort of a like a contingent wrong turn. So it's saying like, you know, the let's say Goldman Sachs has happened to use the pride flag to cover over, you know, as an ideological foil to the fact that it's actually the economic, well, you know, that it's not good, or that it's got degrees as a bit practice. But okay, so first of all, it's capitalism itself, and actually Chris Catrone did a really good analysis of this like ages ago, which I thought was fantastic, about like how capitalism sells us emancipation, but it is the very thing that generates the identity politics and culture wars and exploitation and exclusion of people in its very structure. So it must rely on there being a subject who is elevated or debased, who is outside of the collective of divided consciousness. So you see the sort of, you know, Zizek has this joke about the in a synagogue there is a business owner and a rabbi saying, you know, before the altar, God, I'm not worthy, I'm a terrible person, forgive me, whatever, da, da, da. And then there's a cleaner who is there, who sort of comes and says, well, actually, yeah, same God, I'm also, da, da, da. And the rabbi and the business owner are like, no, not, you're not the same, you know, this is not the same. So there is often this inverse thing, and you see this a lot with racism or Orientalism, where it's like the subject is, and the other is angelic or closer to the nature of the world, the sort of movements of the universe, and can be tapped for knowledge and can teach us how to, you know. So capitalism is the very thing that generates this ideology of exception. Both it needs to contingently exclude phenomena to capitalize, to be able to like capitalize upon it. And there's a certain point where, yeah, I mean, this is, yeah, there's an aside, but that's like a huge rabbit hole to go down into in terms of like capitalist production and value and stuff like that. But anyway, but also it relies on the subject imagining that they are exempt. They can exempt themselves from the force of capitalism, which is to basically proletarianize everyone except for like one monopolist, but be existentially different to other people. And it's interesting, like the way in the arts that one has to present oneself now, in terms of, we talked about the commoditization of subjectivity on The Edge recently. I think it was like a really productive conversation. But you have to be like, as a blah, or as a woman who da 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 da, you know, and it's all these sort of composite forms of forming an identity, which all mean something, and which all contain within them a sort of A equals A. The signifier means this means, you know, and all of that's wrong, you know. And it's, the thing is, as soon as you promise anything, so as soon as you say, we're going to save the planet by eating vegetables, then you get this proliferation of all the biggest companies and tech companies. You know, you have this food as tech, or food as rentierism. I mean, it's funny, we got this deodorant for Christmas, which I just think it's funny. It's like, even deodorant, they have like it's like the name has like a U with an umlaut on it, and this is like tech speak, you know. And then you have to, instead of like buying one deodorant and getting another one, you buy the thing, and then you like rent you have to do this monthly rent payment. Absolutely fucking great. And it's obviously way more expensive and it's pro-environment, whatever. But you get this, you see in supermarkets now a whole aisle of like foods that cater to, and they come with this veneer. It's not that it's like greenwashing. It's that because this is all a theological, a religious sort of, we promise, like within the commodity, if you put the sort of glasses of ideology or whatever from They Live, it's like you can save the world and you can do it, and you do your recycle, you use your straws, whatever. It's like, no, it's a very structure of capitalism itself. It's nobody's fault, and it's not going to be resolved by somebody's individual moral stance. So capitalism is doing this, and this is, we get really tied in knots, and it's really difficult to have conversations about this because it's precisely the do-goodery, and the desire that we all can see that the world is bad. Obviously, this is a massive thing in Chapter 3 of the Communist Manifesto of how this manifests in terms of, bourgeois socialism and utopian socialism and all this kind of stuff, and even, different more reactionary forms. But like instead of talking about, this is not like our desires are not, it's not a moral question at all. It's also not a question of resolving them. I do talk about, like, the best we can kind of do is like traverse the fantasy, which is basically you start enjoying your enjoyment. You start identifying with the symptom. You don't try to make the symptom go away because it's bad. It's like, you are a split subject and you have arbitrary, weird fucking desires based on like stupid logic you had as an 18-month-old child trying to grapple with the nature of reality.
Yeah, I like that.
But like, the best you can do is lower the toxicity of it. And, there are things like, there is stuff that you can do, but it's not in terms of like, so what I hope to convey in the book is not like,
Well, you're learning about yourself through the fundamental fantasy, right? I mean, you're learning about your earliest, or at least very early impulses and structures of your mind, which formed before you were self-aware. And so then the self-aware subject that puts up a moral prohibition against these impulses is precisely the block towards understanding a deeper version of yourself, which is kind of usually why fundamentalist religious orientations that rest on moral presuppositions, usually against libidinal energies and fantasies, are usually structures that I see as blocking the truth as opposed to deeper access
absolutely,
to the
absolutely,
truth.
yeah.
The next Philosophy Portal course focuses on the concept and the tradition of Christian atheism. The course starts October 20th, and more information can be found at philosophyportal.online. Throughout the course, we will be developing themes of modern philosophy in relationship to the project of Christian atheism, including German idealism, Hegelo-Marxism, Nietzsche and psychoanalysis, Althusser's gospel, Zizek's philosophy, and Rollins' theology. The course will also feature guest lectures from Slavoj Žižek, Peter Rollins, and Barry Taylor. To learn more, visit philosophyportal.online.
Yeah, no, there is obviously, what can happen is, and understandably, but this is not, I would say, like, again, not trying to be moral or anything like that, but you can sometimes see, and you see this return to like Catholicism, or a lot of people who are sort of disappointed with where the left has gone, being like, well, I'm just going to become a nun or whatever, which, is one way of doing it. But there is like, one needs courage to engage with the ambivalence and often frightful nature of one's desire in relation to the collective and the fact that other people have other desires, which are all, and one problem with a moralistic start is, of course, on a very basic Freud, is the return of the repressed, that there's going to be an even more egregious symptom that comes later on.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that these are all hugely important issues, and I think that maybe before going deeper into them specifically, I want to also highlight something you said about, we can't repackage psychoanalysis as emancipatory. That's already been done with therapy culture. And that what I take from that is you also don't want to be packaging this sort of psychocinematic approach as necessarily like this grand emancipatory cure or something like that, but just sort of another perspective, another sort of think spilling over of psychoanalysis into the social, which I think is itself an interesting topic, which is the way in which psychoanalysis as a clinical practice is constantly spilling over into society. It can never just stay in the clinic. It has so many, and that's the power of psychoanalysis, I think, is how it spills out into helpful critique of theology or
Yeah.
cinema or other dimensions of society, of economy. And I think one of the challenges, one of the perennial challenges, I guess this would be, I suppose, my perennial philosophy, is that the challenge for the perennial challenges of philosophy, perhaps modern philosophy, is articulating the contours of our freedom and our slavery today. You know,
Yeah, exactly.
it's always very difficult to know, you know, like, and what you think, you know, there's so many weird things where what you think is your freedom is actually your slavery, and people sort of identifying with their slavery as their emancipation. And so these are really like tricky dimensions. And you brought it up in regards to the ways in which the commodity tricks
Yeah.
many people en masse into thinking that they are saving the planet.
Hmm.
I just bought train tickets to the South. And when you're buying the train ticket, I mean, this is comically absurd, but like when you're buying the train ticket, it literally says, if you pay an extra €5, you can offset your carbon emissions.
Yeah.
You know, so, you know, these
Commoditizing
types of,
the solution, you know. Yeah,
it's really weird, right? And I
really
want I
weird.
want to know, like, I sometimes want to go on the train and like ask everyone on the train, is like, how many people are bought
Yeah,
the
have you
extra
done
thing to
it?
offset their carbon emissions or something like that. But
But it's
it's
also a classic thing where it's like you then it's a privilege to do it, or it's like you get to buy the moral superiority when actually it's the working people and poorer people and often people in the global south who are the victims of it, and it's the, you know, the bourgeois person gets to be less of a victim of any sort of changes meted out by the capitalist economy, and then they get to assuage themselves. This is like a very religious thing, right? Like wearing the shirt that's like, I don't know, is there like a shirt in like Christianity that's like painful to wear or whatever, you know, whipping yourself. But by the way, just to go back to the emancipatory question, because it's like, on the one hand, like I absolutely do think like if you promise anything, it can just get commoditized. And it's interesting because you see this in terms of like, the reason why I was just raising the Communist Manifesto a lot is I just happened to have read it this morning again because I was just thinking about something. So it's like right in the fresh of my mind. But it's interesting, like the structure of that and what it has come to be understood to promise. And often from like a conservative perspective, it's like, oh, this is like a crazy, you know, it's all about promising something you can't. It's really not written like that at all. And obviously the Communist Manifesto is very different. But it, you know, in some ways the Communist Manifesto is a bit of a troll. It's like most of it is answering critiques and saying what communism is not. But I do think that there is rather than something being like a promise of oneness and alterity, there is truth and there is reality, and there is a way to navigate reality more healthily and better. And you know, so if there is any promise of psychoanalysis, is that in ordinary unhappiness you can often take actions that are more reasonable, you know, and you might forego something which is some level of jouissance, or you know, some level of enjoyment, suffering, or your relationship to fantasy, which you can be really enjoying and getting you by. But you know, you don't ever sort of forego fantasy really. But you know, I do think in ordinary unhappiness, in terms of picking the living flower, it's in reality, in the grounds of reality, that you can actually build something more real, including like a better society. And better does sort of sound like it has a promise in it. But you know, we have, you know, the collective, we are such an educated population now. We have resources. We live in a world, you know, we have had scientific innovation. Obviously, capitalism, I would argue, is antithetical to scientific innovation. And in fact, if we look at the structure of the scientific method, it's quite similar to the psychoanalytic cure in terms of, or Hegel's philosophy of the owl of Minerva flies at dusk. It's like we enter into, we confront, we put ourselves in position in terms of like the complex and contradictory nature of reality, and we let it unfold to us without our fantasy suppositions of what we want it to be. So there is, I would argue, like not a promise, but there is a practical sort of edge to psychoanalysis that is emancipatory, but it's absolutely the sort of like, you can get rid of all your problems. That's like the real problem, you know. But yeah, So I can't remember what we were saying just
No,
before.
it's I think that brings us to like what I wanted to expand on you with the way you were talking about fantasy and desire. It's not that, you have a symptom which is causing suffering, and then you go to psychoanalysis, and then by the end of the process the symptoms gone or the suffering's over, but it's more rather you get a deeper understanding of the, let's say, the infantile structure of the mind, your own unique relationship to, for example, the
Yeah,
Oedipus complex,
yeah,
and you learn how to either live with or perhaps enjoy differently, or have a
yeah,
perspective shift on what
absolutely,
caused you suffering. It
absolutely.
doesn't necessarily go away. That's why you were sort of talking about the enjoyment of the symptom, enjoyment of the
Yeah,
split. And perhaps what you're trying to do there is learning how to love the weird otherness that is your split subjectivity, or love the weird otherness that is yourself.
yeah,
You
yeah,
are the other to yourself,
yeah, yeah,
and you're
exactly.
trying to love that. And so, in some ways, maybe psychoanalysis could be positioned in this weird movement, which I also see in German idealism between Kant and Hegel,
Yeah,
because for Kant, religion is really a moral question, and for Hegel, religion is really a question of love.
yeah,
And so perhaps this same distinction can
yeah,
be mobilized to understand psychoanalysis and the symptom and
yeah.
these dimensions.
Yeah, and it's interesting because as well, I was just thinking about when you were saying this, it's like also I sort of feel like in order for the sort of form of film that I would hang my hat to work, it still has to on at least. But the thing is, I don't think it's interesting because what's it called? David Lynch is always like, I never, analyze films. It's bad to philosophize about the films or whatever. I used to feel like, okay, on so many different levels, you can philosophize all you fucking want. It still works. Substance is subject. There is more to the film because of the nature of reality, also because of the nature of film production and the fact that it involves so many different people. The film is in excess of what that of which you can conceive as a human. I sound a bit like I quote Anselm in the book who talks about God that way. But anyway, but the point being is that the film itself is much more than anything. So anytime you analyze it in any direction, it's non-total, and the film still works. And the fact of philosophizing about it does something, as you pointed out, the various ways that we can understand our reality. And the film itself, it's almost like rather than like just death of the author, it's also like death of the film, as in like or more than death. There's like an excess in this. There's like it has many lives. So in a sense, I guess on the one hand, I'm saying I do want people to sort of still have this ideological investment in the promise of the film, as in on an unconscious. But again, as you point out, it never goes away because this is a residue of the forming of our subjectivity. That as long as we are alive, it's the price we pay for subjectivity, which is the the all the unconscious and all its vicissitudes. It's like there's nothing we can do about it, but there is, as in we can work with it, we can tarry with it, we can understand it, we can accept it. And so in some ways I do want people to sort of keep believing in the power of film because then you can do transference with it. But I also think that also because of the nature of our unconscious and also because of this material structure of film, that's never going to go away, so we don't have to worry about it. Yeah,
I mean, there's some ideas here that I want to run by you about how we might think about psychocinema, because when you were originally talking about the structural homologies between psychoanalysis and cinema, I was wondering to myself, do I have a transference relationship with cinema in the way you're articulating it? And
yeah,
the idea that I was playing in my head was that I tend away or lose interest in films in which some sort of oneness is promised to me in
yeah,
alterity
yeah,
in the film itself. Like a conventional, the stereotypical or archetypal Disney film or something like
yeah,
that, or some structure, or like a generic rom-com,
yeah, yeah,
or just some generic pop film where you kind of know the story before the story's told, type of thing.
yeah,
I just lose
yeah,
interest.
yeah,
But
yeah,
I was
definitely.
thinking, but I was thinking more about the sort of rise of, for example, people getting interested in like Netflix dramas about like serial killers,
Yeah.
or like being interested in like darker aspects
Yeah.
of life and darker aspects in the cinema genre. And the idea there was, and this is the idea I want to run by you, is like, could this be an example of traversing the fantasy in some sense? Is like where
Yeah.
you're before you've traversed the fantasy, you're kind of interested in this oneness and alterity, but after you've traversed the fantasy, you're kind of interested in the structure of the fundamental fantasy itself in terms of its pulsions, its
That's
unconscious
interesting.
motivations,
Yeah.
its, you know, like the darker sort of
Yeah.
dimensions that are actually you normally create some distance towards, and that there's some sort of transference going on here that could
Yeah.
be quite interesting, because people could be kind of libidinally investing in,
Hmm.
for example, like the serial killer or the horror film or like the darker, because they're interested in these pulsions in themselves.
Definitely. I mean, it's interesting. I've never personally got that much enjoyment out of horror films, but I know a lot of, especially ladies, that do. And I've
Yeah.
wondered if this is to do with the structure of the subjective bucket in a Lacanian sense, like of hysteria. And I've always wondered, like, am I not that? But I don't know. So, but I think the very fact of the excess affect that this is able to generate in people shows that there's something about the technology of film that like operates on the unconscious. That's just a separate. That's sort of quite a basic claim. But it's interesting because I would say that the yeah, people interested in serial killers and why they do it, you know, it's almost like going on a roller coaster, right? Or like going to, actually, oh my god, I once went to you know, Universal Studios in America, in California, and they have like they have these horror houses where like they have actors actually jumping out at you. And I
Hmm.
once went
Yeah.
into a haunted house and I actually cried. I mean, it was just so. I mean, this is just the nature of, you know,
The
the unconscious.
simulation worked.
It works. It works. Even if you're just like, if there's nobody, if they're just acting. Or like the worst horror, like a horror story would be like if one of these actors actually like did have a, you know, they have this Halloween horror night where the whole of Universal Studios turns into like all these actors everywhere with like fake, what do you call it, like saws and stuff. It's like you could really go on a rampage there. Anyway, and actually, there's a whole passage in the book where I talk about like hiding the truth in the truth. You know, could be a good way
Right.
to. Don't get any ideas, anybody. But anyway, so the thing is with so I talk about this in the book, and obviously right now there's a huge cultural issue in terms of gender and sex, and sexuation is something that Lacan sort of talks about, and he posits these two basic poles of hysteria and obsession. Other people have called them imposture for obsession and masquerade for hysteria, and they're two different ways of, or two different sort of tendencies to relate to the question of lack, and they tend to, for historical reasons, historical material reasons, you know, relate across in terms of like what sex you were born into or whatever. And obviously there would be a difference in Lacan for being and becoming and, you know, sex and gender and stuff. And I tend to like not be so prescriptive, or not even prescriptive. Like I think that connection can be quite loose, and I sometimes wonder if it's because in myself I don't, and maybe I am just like a garden variety hysteric. I don't know, but I've always sort of thought like, am I? Am I not? But also, you know, there's lots of different kind of dimensions. There's both the subjective structure that one can experience in terms of, you know, neurosis, psychosis, perversion, and, you know, Leon Brenner's also posited autism as a separate category. And then there's also like stages of psychosexual development that people can get stuck in. Also. So it's kind of hard to like kind of know. But I do know that a lot of people who are maybe within this sexuated neurotic bucket of hysteria, which is not a pejorative term, and in fact and basically the argument of the entire book is that like cinema can hystericize us also. You know, this is not like a pejorative term. In fact, it's like a very nice and polite term for Lacan. It's probably like the most productive. You know, the aim of psychoanalysis is in a sense to hystericize. But so you see in lots of guys out there, or let's say not necessarily guys at all, people of a certain subjective structure, an interest in conspiracy theories and aliens, which I think is to do with the desire to identify the mystery, to work out the mystery of the other's desire, the mystery of their partner's desire, the mystery of the woman's desire, the unknown that they will never have access to. And a lot of obsessive desire sort of revolves around that question. And sort of obviously the
The
aliens.
elusive feminine jouissance.
Exactly. And it's true. I like sort of critique this idea of there's a certain canonical critique of the Alien movies that took place in the 70s, which I think I find more interesting. And actually this came out of a conversation that I had with Tad DeLay about a Marxist reading of Alien. I think it's more about workers than it is about like the monstrous feminine or whatever. But this idea that aliens, just in terms of the mystery of what do they want, who are they, and that could be identified as that sort of form of desire. But also the hysteric where, by the way, as well, like Lacan is very un-PC, but also I sort of, and it's interesting how the culture wars have sort of come about in terms of this question of gender and sex, because I would consider myself more universalist when it comes to psychoanalysis. So these questions of sexuation are less interesting to me because I would more be interested in how we are all emerged from lack. And I think in terms of referring psychoanalysis to like the political economy, which is kind of what I'm interested in, for me, it's more interesting to think about how there is a universal lack, and it's capitalism that keeps sort of promising a sort of a transcendent difference. And I think sometimes there can be an incorrect tendency to sexuation obviously is something that does exist, but sexuation necessitates the subjective split first, which is something that happens to everybody, and one experiences it or deals with it in different ways. And then again, in terms of one's concrete sexual fantasies, they're also polyvalent. So I'm more interested in the thing that comes first, I would say, rather, because sometimes people, but that's not to say I think sexuation is also really important. And I think what's really interesting in it for me is how it refers to lack in all, but in terms of the masquerade as a different form of sexuation, this desire to be desirable, which we also all have.
Of course.
But this is so the desire to be desirable, and there is something thrilling about this idea of being so desirable that one would have to be snuffed out. So I think there is this sort of idea of the serial killer that, and I think, as I say, like everybody can identify with that. And that's something that I really go into in the book, is it's like you can watch a film and experience, you might have like less of a libidinal investment, but you can be
being so desirable that you're dangerous.
Yeah, exactly. And that's terrifying, but it is, but there is, but in terms of like our relationship to characters, and I guess this is something as well that both because I would say this, it's more of a metonymic analysis rather than a poetic one. And I do kind of talk about something that really interests me is this question of A does not equal A. So the signifier and the polyvalence of the signifier. So I'm less interested in sort of representational questions in cinema, because I also think that this is a sort of a capitalist turn in turning some of the emancipatory issues in terms of making society fairer. It becomes a sort of it turns it into a transcend. In terms of it, instead of it being an ordinary unhappiness, living flower question, it turns it into an abstract, transcendental commodity question. And I think the fact that we can identify with different forms of desire, and that we can identify with a 70-year-old woman or a 10-year-old boy is a question that always gets readily forgotten. But that's obviously like a very basic question. But I think what was interesting is you were raising this idea of how our, the promise of our emancipation can get turned against us.
Yeah.
And how it's always really important and difficult to ever analyze the manifest form of capitalism. And I do think that understanding the underlying desire structure or libidinal dynamic can help us do that. And often what happens is we rely on past forms of critique. And you see this so much in critical theory, which were like absolutely relevant in a more patriarchal society in the 20th century. But then that critique in and of itself becomes concretized, what is sacred in it is profaned, it becomes a commodity, and then it's like, then we get the culture war of men versus women at a time when, patriarchy is precisely dissolved by the forces of capitalism, as is pointed out by Marx like endlessly. So, and in terms of, there's also this really important point of the subaltern, right? You can never identify the victim until it's too late, because precisely as soon as they have the voice and are recognized as such, you're not in the position. So often the critique, especially the one that's accepted and sold back to us as an emancipatory promise, and you can see, well, like, oh, if we think back to this year and this thing happened, of course we have evidence and we don't want that to repeat, and obviously it then gets re-exploited as sort of an urgency question. So we can't have any conversations because it's urgent, because we all die. But then, we have to sort of theologize that tendency whilst acknowledging all of these things. As Zizek points out, you can be a hypochondriac and really have cancer. You can be paranoid and they can be out to get you. You can be, or they can be out to get you and you can be paranoid. Obviously, the other way around. Or you can be a toxically jealous spouse and your partner's having an affair. So, humans don't operate. I think this is a really important point in terms of split subjectivity. It's like nothing is neutral in the terrain of subjectivity. There's always an excess. There's always a too muchness, and that can be repressed and weaponized towards a direction of desire that is against our best interest and towards, the death drive of capital. And it's interesting you pointed out, because, like, in a sense, we're always historically dealing with the same thing. It's just that different forms. If we're going from a sort of Hegelian reading, like, where this is taking place is more repressed. So it's true. It's like, the Crusades had a similar sort of tenor to later forms of 19th century empire, which has the same tendencies as corporate colonialism in the 21st century. It's like, it's the promise of oneness, like subjectivity, self-consciousness emerged, and we have to deal with it, and we deal with it in different forms, but it's a dynamic. So it's not like capitalist desire is to do with this impulse as it emerges in our current condition, which liberalism casts as completely natural, universal. And it's also really annoying when there's a criticism of like an attempt for universalism but there's a confusion. Just because capitalism promises it's universal and claims that everybody has equal access to the market doesn't mean it does. And then identifying with taking a reactive sort of particularist identity political position, that's actually the capitalist position, because that's actually what capitalism is doing. Just because it's promising universal doesn't mean it actually is. So the universalism we're talking about, and the Marxists talking about, and that maybe we can extrapolate from Hegel, is a dialectical universalist one about lack, literally everything. So we can't buy into the promise. We can't take capitalism at its word.
Mm-hmm. Right. So what I'm taking from this and going to try and connect it to your Psychocinema project a little bit is, this universal lack and its relationship to excess is something that I think we need to get right, because I think we've highlighted the central importance of lack, but I think sometimes what gets overlooked is the dimension of excess. And I think that was, you brought that up in the example of you can be paranoid and they're still out to get you.
Yeah.
There's some lack and there's still this excess there. You can be a hypochondriac and you actually have cancer, or you could be toxically jealous and your partner is cheating on you. And at least with that last example, Zizek seems to suggest that even in the case where your partner is cheating on you, the toxic jealousy is itself pathological.
Exactly.
So what I take that to be pointing towards is that we need to learn how to identify and reconcile with the negativity of the excess itself.
Yeah.
In order to really be interested in the truth.
Yeah.
Or they say the truth of the real. Yeah. And I think that here Psychocinema offers us a really cool window into this truth of the real, because you say, and you've said previously in our discussion, that cinema operates on our unconscious and generates these excessive affects itself. And throughout the book, you talk about how there's a certain magic of cinema here.
Yeah.
Like that there's a magic of cinema in the excess, in the surplus.
Yeah.
So what can we learn about this negativity of excess
Yeah.
individually and socially through this sort of way of thinking about cinema?
Yeah. No, I really like this title from one of TJ's books of Less Than Nothing. It's
Oh, I
like
love that too.
we are because we are less than nothing. And I think this is like, it's not, that 1 + 1 equals 2. It's that one exists because there is, in one's existence is that which isn't one. And in the existence of the split is excess. So often, there's a critique of people who maybe aren't so familiar with Lacan of like, oh, you guys should stop talking about lack. That's such a negative thing to talk about. And actually, that's kind of depressing. I mean, that's maybe straw manning it or whatever. But like, no, it's actually precisely because of this foundational existence of it that excess is possible. That it, and that subjectivity is possible at all. And
Yeah.
and the thing is, it's interesting. I mean, I sort of,
People obfuscating lack are obfuscating subjectivity and the truth of this dimension.
yeah, exactly. And the thing is, so object-oriented ontology had like a sort of a thing a while back, and I'm not like super familiar with it at all. But there was a book that I really appreciated by Quentin Meillassoux about this poem by this symbolist poet from the late 19th century in France called Stéphane Mallarmé, and it's all about the poem is about contingency and chance, and the roll of a dice will never obliterate chance. So the thing is, it's like miracles for this position occur precisely because we live in a material universe and you can roll a double six. If there was it's not that like miracles show that there's a God. It's like if miracles or an undivided God or whatever, if miracles existed and proved that there was a God, they wouldn't be miracles because they would just be matter of course for some being who has sort of transcendent capability. So the point being is, it's like lack itself generates the miracle of excess, and this is the immanent transcendence of life. It's interesting, like I also there's also this resistance as well in terms
It's
of
like a way of understanding creation ex nihilo, or like something out of nothing.
Exactly. No, but this is the thing, because I do think this is like a really important philosophical point in psychoanalysis, and I think it's a very rational explanation of an atheistic explanation, right? Atheistic in I don't know if atheistic is the right term, as in yeah. I mean, I think we're probably both familiar with like the work of people who are into Christian atheism, but it's like the division of the one.
Yeah, the division in God himself.
Exactly. So, no, I had a point
Just
actually.
to articulate like the idea that like usually God is depicted as this being who knows everything, who's everywhere, who is not lacking.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that like at least the traditions we follow are and this does have roots in German idealism.
Yeah.
Is just the idea that no God lacks as well. That's or that God himself doesn't believe in himself.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
it's
like this is the weird thing about Christian atheism, I think.
yeah, and it's like, oh God, why hast thou forsaken me? Where are you,
Right.
Daddy?
But this is where this doubt is inscribed into God. And I think that's like also interesting. Like I mean, we could go into like the Trinity or something like that, and the
Yeah.
way the Trinity kind of separates Christianity from other monotheist traditions where Judaism and Islam don't have a space for the Trinity, where precisely this doubt can be inscribed into God himself through the structure of the Trinity, because Christ is alone. Christ
Yeah,
is impotent. Christ is walking a path which leads not only to his. I think this is important. Like Christ is walking a path that doesn't only lead to his death, but leads to his like violent betrayal Like it's like it's
Yeah.
worse than that, like so.
I know. God, sticky end, sticky end. Oh my God, but no, and it is interesting. It's things like again, like I can't speak for other traditions. I'm really not an expert, but like you have in Judaism these sort of more arbitrary, like performative rituals that you sort of do, and then you kind of go on with the rest of your week. Because so in a sense, there's often in these practices a kind of conscious, unconscious management of the excess so that one can actually just confront, but yeah, what I was going to say is the thing is this: it can sometimes there can be accusations of like psychoanalysis being like idealist or like woo woo whatever. And it's funny, I had a conversation with a friend the other day who's like, my conspiracy theory is that psychoanalysis invented the unconscious to sell therapy or whatever. And I'm like, no, I actually think the unconscious explicates or points towards. And I think, often with an analytics, from the analytic approach or the analyst discourse, it's like anything leads to all of it. And the unconscious is one of these things that if you sort of understand what it is, where it comes from, where, quote unquote, it exists, quote unquote, this sort of says a lot. But it's interesting because it's like, even in the very structure of language, we can talk about like Hegel's relationship or, concept of A does not equal A, which I think is like such a helpful entry into like an understanding of psychoanalysis and like metonymy. But I was funny. I often it comes up where what was it? Oh yeah, where I would say, oh, nothing's absolute, like nothing itself, and they'll be like, you can't say that, you can't say that because nothing, you can't say that because nothing's absolute, and I'm like, hey, you just said it, nothing's absolute. Do you see what I mean? It's like it's there in language already.
Play on it. And
It's like,
Peter,
yeah,
our friend Peter Rollins, he does a good job of this in his latest publication, The Profane Temple, where he's like, nothing saves, nothing. He's
yeah.
doing this play on
Exactly.
on
And I
nothing.
think this is where, we were talking about this like emancipatory question because of course, like you can't promise oneness, right? But you can maybe say that there is such thing as the everyday, the living flower or ordinary unhappiness or whatever. But the thing is, it's like it's different. Lack. You might say that you're turning, you're negating the negation and saying it's like a concrete thing, but it's not a concrete thing. It's lack. It's nothing. And it's different, so like, and it's there, as I say, in language, so it's not like you're saying, oh, you can't, you can't say this, you can't say that there's this absolute, but it's like the statement of negating the absolute does it for you, right? Nothing is absolute. I agree.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that this is something that I actually tried to point towards in my first paper in the philosophy portal anthologies Enter the Alien, where I go through the basically the structure of Hegel's chapter on absolute knowing.
Yeah,
And in that paper, I kind of put a note at the end of the paper that this way of thinking is not a rejection or a deconstruction of the new atheists, but rather sort of like a kind of an extension of their work in this way, where they're sort of negating God, and I think we just need to negate their negation of God. So it's
yeah,
it's
yeah,
kind of it's kind of like not really adding anything to what they're saying. They are kind of right. It's just that they don't have this sort of dialectical logic which would help them sort of, let's say, historically and socially extend their work
yeah,
towards something like a civilizational project. But I think that this does bring us to sort of and we've throughout this conversation we've been discussing these buzz terms like traversing the fantasy and ontological lack. But I think where we're getting to with the negation of negation is sort of the importance of the logic of contradiction. And throughout the book, you talk about how basically the stakes of the way you're thinking about both psychoanalysis and capitalism is to get us out of the logic of opposition and towards the logic of contradiction. And so,
yeah.
how do you see that at work in psychocinema, and how should we be paying attention to perhaps the way we can sort of spontaneously fall into opposition when
Yeah,
really this is sort of more of a symptomal stance as opposed
yeah,
to going deeper into, like you've already mentioned, the scientific method helps us go
yeah.
deeper into contradiction, psychoanalysis helps us go deeper into contradiction.
No, exactly. I do have sort of a critique of like the what Lacan calls the university discourse, which in a sense, has nothing to do with what we imagine the best of the university is. It's just within the sort of liberal and neoliberal framework, that which, so truth, which by necessity embraces contradiction, if we accept that we live in a complex and contradictory universe, becomes re-oppositionalized and weaponized as a way to hide the capitalist discourse with sort of confidence of critique. And I think like a lot of these ideas came out of a frustration with what I think has happened in terms of an understanding of Lacan's contribution to cinema, which isn't Lacan's contribution to cinema. And it's precisely so, and as I say, like loads of these thoughts and conversations have come out of my experience as a filmmaker making films in the 21st century, sometimes in America, sometimes in Europe, sometimes elsewhere, and what we have to confront materially, and how all of that is mystified by the logic of opposition, which has been used in a very decorative and consciously proclaiming emancipatory way to prevent art from being produced. Art itself, this is a thing that's sort of a bit worrying, because art itself resists commodification. You can say, right, like an art piece gets a Basquiat painting gets sold for 10 million to an art collector, whatever. And it's
Just
true
look
that
at Banksy, for example.
exactly any object can be commoditized, but there has to be some discourse generation around it to sort of make it fit in terms of the logic and all this kind of stuff. And you know that famous artists being used as brand or whatever, and what the concept of brand does. It's funny, like when you have a logo, it's just like a word and it conceals like all these things like child exploitation, you know, surplus value, destruction of the planet, but it's like, oh, it's a pretty word. But in terms of the experience of art itself, if it is art, which is sometimes in art that has been commoditized, if it's read and witnessed in a certain way, but often like this commoditization of art is like, it's interesting, yeah. You get these sort of, I was just at the Wallace collection in London the other day, which is free to go to, but it's like it relies on patronage and whatever. As in this wealthy family has this collection and lets you view it for free. And so in a sense, like that's an an antique, a feudal mode of outside of capitalism, because like patronage is one way of doing it, but obviously patronage relies on the exploitation of others for the patron's money. But I mean, it's a really long story about like what's happened in Europe, where you have these governing bodies that were originally designed to mitigate against the work excesses of capitalism and protect, you know, local film and develop and local filmmakers and works and all that kind of stuff. And absolutely the opposite has happened. It's become a focus on trade, which has meant that majority of government money and government tax breaks, etc., go to, as has happened with tech, corporate colonial practices, and we have like state-sponsored trickle-down socialism, and it's destroyed the landscape for actual like workers who there is no industry for them to continue to work in, for like people who are sort of doing more kind of on the creative side. You know, there's no sort of smaller production companies who can't compete for various, you know, you can't compete against a production that's getting £1 million an episode and all the crew in the country and all the resources, and you know, so all of these people go, and then there is only one funding source. And basically it's the same thing that has happened in a sense with the surplus genius question we've talked about. Like we're all overeducated, we've all been to university, we've all got into debt to do so, and we're all the reserve army of people wanting sort of more prestigious careers. And one way when you can't differentiate between this, and there's too many people, especially when people are like so overly qualified for things that, you know, you wouldn't have needed any qualifications for in the past, you know, it's a moral question starts to occur. And in terms of the more we've talked about like the return repressed, the repressed contradiction, which is all, you know, in our goodly age of right think and radical centrism and all this kind of stuff, comes in this returned repressed of moralism. This is also to do with the global rate of profit basically being zero, and needing to find value to be generated through sacrifice in all sorts of different ways. This happens through the commoditization of the commons with social media, and even the commoditization of subjectivity. So we all must perform ethics, and a lot of this has come through a misunderstood version of, let's say in different epochs. Obviously, you had, if we look at the Christ figure versus the ideological foil in like 19th century and early 20th century America in terms of religion, those are like completely different things, right? And you have, civil rights questions and original thinkers in terms of, critiquing capitalist faux universalism and looking at ways at emancipating different groups. But what has happened now is this commodification of subjectivity that has taken on this moralistic hue and often uses precisely that which was a technology to undermine capitalist desire as the thing that sustains it. And therefore it becomes very difficult to navigate and to question. And as you say, like often, you might be cast as a conservative for not buying into radical capitalist progressivism, even though conservatism is a completely different thing than wanting to be more progressive than capitalist progressivism, or to be actually a Marxist or a leftist or whatever. But it's often because I think this is also to do with the fear of proletarianization. So as Marx points out, like the proletariat recruits from all classes. We can at any point be proletarianized. And there's been a huge proletarianization via the very promise of investing in the thing that's going to save you from that, which is a neoliberal education, getting into debt, doing years and years and years. You see, my husband and I called it the holding pen. What's happened in academia is absolutely crazy. The years and years and years. You might be 40 years old if you're lucky before you actually get a post. And often what happens is there is a desire to identify with the ethical, and often having concerns around ethics. I mean, this is like, again, to refer to chapter 3 of the Communist Manifesto, like the bourgeois socialist, the idea of being able to have ethical concerns or to perform them in terms of what it signifies is it can often be this is not like real ethic, because everybody has the capacity to be ethical, right? Like it becomes a sort of cultural capital, the philanthropic, charity work or whatever. And people can identify with that which they learned at university as a cultural signifier against the trauma of their own proletarianization, which is horrific, which basically explodes the whole promise of capitalism, that points to a waste of their libidinal energy, the lie of their fantasy, the excess, the debt they've got into, the excess effort they've put in to be educated. And as I point out in the book, like people, the way that fantasy operates and its protective mechanism against a confrontation with the real. And this is why like psychoanalysis must be attenuated, and it's like it can be very fucking traumatic thing to go through. Even though you could also just like, if you were capable, it's not like, yeah, the work of psychoanalysis is necessary, but you could also just explicate it of just like, you're able to accept things in a slightly different way. But like in depression and mourning and melancholia, this is about like the breaking of the chain of signifiers. So when you have been libidinally invested in a sort of a means of meaning making, and either through the death of somebody who's part of that libidinal network that protects you from the real, they go, or the loss of something, or the loss of the fantasy image of yourself, it's so traumatic, and the grieving process is real. And if you can't grieve, you become extremely depressed. It's so painful. So to, humans, if you look at like churches that they sort of made in the name of God, and what people, the explosion of like capitalist production, which the ideology of promise like gets people to do crazy, amazing things. people also, would climb Everest and risk death. Humans are not rational in terms of like the way they mete out their efforts. And if you think of the excess sacrifice and excess labor and excess debt that has been taken on by a whole generation of people, and that's gone to some people, and and it's interesting. There's this guy, this people's economist, Gary's economics, Gary Stevenson. I think he's very good, and some people have sort of criticised him that he's not Marxist or whatever, but I think he's from a more liberal background. But he's used reason to identify what he calls inequality, and inequality is quantum, and so the value in capitalism goes somewhere, and that inequality, that level of inequality, like increases and increases. For instance, like the more inequality there is, in this university, when you win, you lose, you lose. The more inequality, the higher the asset prices, the fewer routes there are to a middle class life. You can't buy houses anymore. People think like we've got no money, so there must be a collapse in the economy. But if you understand how the rich don't spend their money and invest it, you have an inflation in asset prices. So we're fucked in so many different directions. So it's not surprising. But what has happened to have happened is that often a sort of bourgeois ethical interpretation of critical theory has, and I guess this is just one attempt through psychocinema to reopen that turning away, that door that's been closed, back to its original intention. I don't know if there was an intention, not even that like another side of it that we need to think about in new ways in relation to the 21st century. And I sort of think about this in terms of like some of these ideas that have really caught on, which even, I'd have critiques about them in the first place, but then there's also different ways of interpreting them, but the ways that they have been concretized within studies is not Lacanian. And even if it was, you'd have to readjust the relationship between the signifier and its attempt at signification in our current predicament, which is very different to that which our parents or grandparents were going through. There are similarities, of course. We still live in capitalism. There's, in a sense, we need to be more Marxist. It's not that like, we need to always reaffirm and keep looking at and being aware that we can always get turned off. What's it that the devil is the I don't know, there's some statement about like often you think it's precisely what you think is the good thing is the opposite. I don't know, but it's often it's really the confidence of critique where you think you're being righteous and actually you've sort of missed the core of it. Yeah, I don't want to use satanic language because that sounds absolutely terrible. Because I don't think that at all. But I'm just saying
this sort of overconfidence of self-consciousness in some way.
Yeah, and I think it's really important, and I do think it's contingent material factors in our age group in terms of it. The radical proletarianization of masses of people has happened through. In the 90s, the New Labour government had this slogan: education, 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 and this
So let's maybe go into, this is a really powerful point that you brought up at the edge as well, this process of proletarianization. And if there is this structural homology between psychoanalysis and psychocinema, how might people come to terms perhaps with the death of a certain fundamental fantasy through psychocinema? Are there sort of anything that you can point towards in that direction? Because as you rightly say, it is quite traumatic, and I'd imagine it's a huge cultural symptom that many people are going through, in the sense of people who are overeducated, overqualified, have dreams of a more prestigious career, and we just have to readjust our expectations, and we have to readjust our way of being and our way of relating to a very different reality than the reality we were encultured in and educated in under a neoliberal structure.
I know.
Starting in 2024, Philosophy Portal opened The Portal, a live event space dedicated to making philosophy actual. Every month we host 4 events organized under a common theme, designed to build different discursive spaces, to learn concepts, explore the edge of thinking, learn from thought leaders, and get personal about our intellectual journeys. Members get access to a living thinking community and access to the entire history of events, as well as discounts on recorded and future courses. Couples are very much encouraged and get a 2-for-1 discount. To learn more, visit philosophyportal.online and consider becoming a member today. The Portal, the work of the concept. Liberal structure.
I know it, and it's definitely this is not to say to give up on one's fantasy or anything like that, but you know, one can it's not even cease, but act in one's best interest when one understands the way that capitalism exploits one's structure of desire. One can, but you know, again, it's a really difficult one to answer because like there is this question of like there's the possibility of confrontation with capitalism at different points of its crisis, and we are obviously in a moment of crisis, and one of the hallmarks of capitalism is its crisis. And there are certain things that Marx points to in terms of, you know, I wouldn't even call them solutions, but different ways of relating to the means of production and stuff like that. I don't know what that looks like in terms of the economy we live in now. And I also know that this isn't also to be like accepted, you know, in any way, shape, or form. Sometimes, though, one is able to act in one's best interest and not accept it, and do and aim for changes in one's material conditions precisely when one ceases to buy into the lie of it anymore. So, okay, let's talk about like an example of this is in film, the festival industrial complex. So it's kind of insane how these things work. And this is not at all to blame people who run festivals and who work in these, you know, these roles, these sort of arts management roles, because we're all part of the same economy. But what happens is, let's say the Sundance Film Festival, you might have like tens of thousands of short films that are made. The short films, if you're very lucky, you might get government funding, but that's less and less and less and less and less because the industry itself has been undermined by the government policy. So, you know, the grave has been dug years ago. And this is how, you know, Marx points out as well, like the bourgeois society is undermining itself all the time. And it's in the profit seeking that it collapses itself. I mean, I can give loads of examples of this, but like, for instance, you know, Brazil, I talk about this as an example in the film, but the Terry Gilliam film, but like Hinge, the app where it says designed to be deleted. That's absolutely not true. If everybody deleted it, there would be no profit making. Basically, there has to be a problem that can be capitalized on. And so there might be a need to generate a problem, or there might be a need to not quite give you what you want. And capitalism also does this thing of like giving you just enough of what you want. So obviously with social media, you can think about like, I've met loads of my friends from high school that I hadn't seen in years. I met loads of people in my field throughout the world who, you know, I met Cadell on Instagram, whatever. But it also comes at a huge, huge cost, which is the commoditization of subjectivity, the commoditization of the commons. How do we think when our subjectivity is capitalized upon? And I think there is this interesting moment now where I feel like there is a rising desire in people to think precisely because they're prevented from doing so within the commons all the time. And because of the commoditization of everything and the fact that people are really educated. I think this is a contradiction in capitalism that is a problem for capitalism. Like, one of the problems is everybody is so overqualified, and often if the system is really death-driven and deliberately incompetent to constantly create problems to solve, you know, you would have too intelligent, too overly qualified people would sort of be like, what the fuck? So, you know, this is a problem. And obviously neoliberal education offers a certain form of education, but there is a sense of reading and learning is a useful thing. And this is the thing, is I'm not against, I did go through this very hippie, I was a teacher for a while and I got really fed up with the education system. But I think in retrospect, I was 22 to 24 years old. I was pissed off with, you know, commodified education and weaponized, you know, structure, you know, exam. And I sort of had this, you know, the Supertramp song School, like, really spoke to me at the time. And now I'm like, actually, I do like learning and I do think philosophy is really important and I do think everybody should have a bit of it, but I don't think commodifying it is the way to do it. What was I saying before that? I had a point on the tip of my tongue.
Was it related to the sort of the way in which we might be able to traverse the fantasy through
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I was talking about the film festival. So the value of the films that do well in these festivals is generated by the sacrifice of all the people who don't get in. So there was this when I was younger, there was this woman in the UK who was this really fantastic athlete called Paula Radcliffe, who was the world marathon record holder by like a long way. And if you watched a Nike ad at the time, you'd imagine that the way that the gold medal was valuable was Paula Radcliffe's blood, sweat, and tears. She trained harder than anyone else. She put the work in. No, the value of the gold medal is all the people's the excess sacrifice of all the people who didn't make it. That's what makes it valuable. That's how value is generated in capitalism. So, and so the fetish object. Obviously, we talked about this is a big thing for in terms of like a Marxist critique of capitalism. But like part of it is also this magical quality, this libidinal promise in the oneness of alterity that this commodity can get you a little closer to. You can buy a bit of, and that sort of mystifies everybody's sacrifice. So yeah, in a festival, the people who get in or the winning film, the value of it, and also the cultural capital for all the people working in the arts management jobs is generated by the people who fund their own film. Not only fund their own film, do thousands of hours to generate the film, and to have all this excess creation. And this is why it's funny, like 10, 15 years ago, there was this whole thing of like, everybody's going to be self-employed and we're democratizing the process of being a creative or whatever. No, it's like we now have millions of excess creators, which actually just generates the value for the people. Basically, it's not that it's liberating for everybody. You get the tiny exceptions who get found in the depths of SoundCloud. It's that the people who are already on the lifeboats after the collapse of the Titanic, who control the means of production, more value is generated for them by everybody's sacrifice. So then what happens is you apply for these festivals and you have to pay $100. So you're also paying more. And then there's this excess jouissance that's created in terms of, will I get it, will I not? And this outrage politics when you don't, and sort of one's participation on social media, you post about your film, this is a whole commodification of the commons, it's a whole separate thing, it's a whole way of creating value. But the reality is that if you added together every film, so not only that's egregious enough where you're like, what? Why am I doing this? Why am I? When also most of the slots have been filled, not only by corporate films, because most of it, like the corporations have sort of bought a little bit of the indie thing, and they get the cultural capital of that, but also because most of the films, how do you pick out of 70,000 films? Well, you have to be like, okay, the ethical question, which films make us look, we're sponsored by a credit card company, shit, let's make sure we have a film about somebody who later down the line is really fucked by the economic structure generated by the credit card company who's funding the film. So let's just make sure it looks good. So all of these things are sort of chosen. And even if you added up all the films, there would never be enough people picking the films to actually be able to watch them. So when you actually start thinking in these terms and how the prestige, I was also watching a video the other day about how the Oscars was set up as a union busting exercise to get film workers who were heads of departments to stop recognizing themselves as workers and start thinking themselves as artistes for whom prestige was more important. And this is another thing that is really important to recognize. Sacrifice, it's not just money, especially when money is scarce. Sorry, that's my there are things that start to be things on the way to money, including prestige. Sorry, my dad keeps phoning me. But then when you realise that these things actually don't signify anything, or there's no there, or whatever, or that you were never going to get it because the whole thing is, again, this is the classic capitalism. It promises a universalism, it promises a meritocracy, it promises fair entry, but then you actually have a material reading of it. You can't actually, you've got to libidinally invest in things, you've got to keep your libido going, your desire going, and all this kind of stuff, but you stop investing in things that really you're confronted with the fact that it's not going to work. Sort of. I mean, I think it's a long process, and I'm not. I don't think there's like it's.
Is it that you stop investing things externally that aren't going to work and that are promising the opposite, and that you learn to work with the not working itself? Like that this is how I sort of understand the movement from desire to drive.
Yeah.
That you start to become more interested in the your own
Yeah,
internal impotences.
exactly,
You
exactly,
start to get interested in your own internal
exactly,
the way you are not working, as opposed
exactly,
to delaying this confrontation with your own
exactly.
not working in the external perfect thing.
Exactly. Very much so. Very much so. And um, yeah, no, I was just
Which
thinking
is
about
kind of reconciling with your own sort of, like the object patiyas, the
yeah,
lacking object, and
yeah,
your own self impossibility,
mhm,
your own impossibility to be
yeah.
yourself, your own impossibility to fully coincide with yourself.
And yeah, understanding the thing is that these things can be of material. This is not to be like it's not all one thing or the other. It's like these things do again. It's like the you can be a hypochondriac and still have a serious illness. It's like you can be critical of the Oscars, but it still also works. As in, like if you get one, it'll help your career, or whatever. So that's the thing you kind of have to negotiate. But it's like when you really confront so fantasy often mystifies the sacrifice that occurs in capitalism, and it's actually really, really egregious when you look at it, you know. But again, it's not enough to just think about it. But it is productive to tarry with one's own lack and one's own desire, which are often nonsensical and you know don't really accord with the structure of society as it well not the structure of society but like are not canonical, as in you don't need to be doing what everyone else is doing and all this kind of stuff. um but
It's
yeah, I
out
feel
of
like
place,
yeah, out of place. I feel like I had a
potentially
point
disruptive.
previously. Oh yeah, but the point being is I think also you know there's all sorts of the signifier activism. I think means all sorts of different things now, and again is maybe one of these signifiers that gets one can be an activist sometimes when one doesn't have certain more material concerns about paying bills. That's not always the case, but I'm just saying that there sometimes you get sort of nepo babies being activists, which is like good on them. But also this sort of confidence of we know where we're going, is in like a corporation might bring in an activist to talk to them about something because as long as we do a nominal sort of version of this activism, we sort of put more female CEOs in, then. But one is more capable of actually confronting and doing the work, the political work for change, when one is not so invested in certain prestige signifiers, which often, as I said, it can sometimes come with precarity that one recognizes that, or privilege. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways that one can sort of be exposed to things. But you can actually start to tarry with things, also recognizing that there is no big other. So
Mhm.
sometimes we get invested in prestige because the big other has told us who we are and affirmed our goodness, or our morality or our productivity or our success. But there is no big other as well. But that's also something that theologically we can come towards when we kind of understand. And again, like I so there is no like rationalizing your way to the cure, in a sense. But I do also think that philosophy, bit by bit, you know admitting its impetus, in its impotence also, it's worth talking about all these things, definitely.
Yeah, maybe rationalizing yourself to the cure isn't going to help, but accommodating your rationality to the truth could help.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely
Something
wonderful.
like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so winding down in terms of like the meaning of psychocinema and sort of what you're trying to communicate with this book, what would you sort of say as like a sort of for anyone who's been listening to us for this conversation, why get into this book, Psychocinema? What is maybe a concluding message you would want to sort of share with an audience about
Yeah, I mean,
the
I
meaning
am
of
like,
this book?
yeah, I'm a hyper film fan. I'm obsessed with film. I watch it in my leisure time. I try to make it in my non-leisure time, um, or whatever. But so I'm sort of biased about cinema, obviously. But I think that it's as good an entry point as any film to think about these things. Like somebody could be revolving around their work in a different field and could, be thinking in Lacanian or Hegelian terms and are using that situation as an object lesson. And I do sort of think that, film is as good an entry point as any. But I also do think that film is this contingent medium that happened to be created at the end of the 19th century, that developed in a certain way in the 20th century, that provides the human subject with a technology, like a place. We could see cinema as an act that does something to desire, that mobilizes it, and that allows us to either think about desire in different ways if we're attuned to it, or that does something to the unconscious. And I think, there has been historically all these critiques, and I guess it's to do with, at different times in capitalism, the repression is like, the contradiction is less and less repressed. So, of course, if we're talking about like patriarchal narratives at different periods of time, that's interesting at those periods of time. I think now the religious tendency, what is at stake in capitalism, is so repressed that we need something that is more unconsciousness raising, that it's not so easy as to just say, this is it. And I think that film happens to be a technology. So Pete, who we were talking about before, he has this notion of transformance art. So he I would say, is a vulgarizer of psychoanalysis, but also is a practitioner in certain senses of a more sort of like forward-facing attempt to theologize the ideology of promise. And he does so in certain like liturgical practices. And one of his ideas is transformance art. So it's not just like, it's that the engaging with a dynamic in art can do something to our libido and expose contradiction to us. And I think different forms of art do this. Like if you go and see a Rothko painting, for me, like it always sounds so corny, but like it makes me cry, and it feels like a confrontation with the crack at the core of reality. Like, and that's just a visual representation of that. That's just an interpretation that one person might have. And novels are also work on plot and affect and all those kind of things, that they could have an interesting you could look at them in interesting ways. But I think that film, the way that it's made, the way that it's watched, the history of it as it emerged alongside capitalism in the 20th century, and it could also just be me trying to be like, everybody, film is important, and I actually see film slipping through my fingers because of the changing material conditions. But yeah.
But I think, to your point, and I think what lends itself to your analysis is that, and kind of bringing us full circle in the conversation in a way, is that I think it's a huge misconception that the unconscious is like in the depths or hidden behind the surface. And I think that, the idea in the Proto-Lacanian tradition that the unconscious is social, the
Yeah.
unconscious is on the surface, the
Yeah.
unconscious is right there staring at you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that cinema does offer a window. I mean, I would say, music offers a window into the unconscious.
Yeah.
Athletics offers a window into the unconscious. All of, politics offers a window into the unconscious. And there's something revolutionary about this move,
Yeah.
from learning about the clinic, learning about what was discovered in psychoanalysis, and having a place for the clinic, but at the same time recognizing this spilling over effect into society, and the way in which this knowledge, which was originally in the clinic, needs to come out into its anthropological dimensions and its media dimensions and its political dimensions. And I
Yeah.
think that, whether it's the Slovenian school, which is doing political analysis of the unconscious, or whether it's this work here that's doing sort of a more media and a cinema and a arts view of the unconscious, this is sort of I think where the frontier's at. So I appreciate it, and I would definitely encourage everyone. Of course, there'll be links in the description to Helen Rollins' Psychocinema. Are there any sort of final thoughts about either this book or your ongoing work that you would want to point people
Yeah,
towards?
I'm not sure. It's been interesting. Like, it's definitely been an interesting, like, process to write a book, because I sort of see myself as having like fallen into like theory and philosophy. It wasn't like my intention. It's interesting how things sort of work out that way. But it's also quite anxiety producing. I mean, I think the world is anxiety producing anyway, but particularly our world as it is right now. You never, precisely because I think in the commons, one is presented via social media, via all sorts of things. As the internet has been completely commoditized. The other is whole and complete. So they're not, so you don't know what's going on inside their head, but also there is a sense that the other knows more than oneself, but the other is also thrown into this complex and chaotic universe with a split subjectivity, and they don't even know what they know or even know what they desire. So it's interesting doing something new. You're like, I'm doing a book. What happens? And it's funny because, like, having done lots of film and stuff, I think when you first do it, often it's like you have the naive sort of belief that it's going to transform your life in some way or be interesting or like be whatever, and then you do it and you're like, oh, it's what's actually kind of crazy is that nothing happens and no one's interested, and it's like,
Yeah.
yeah.
That was my zero level experience when I published my doctoral thesis. I thought, I've been working on this book for like 6 years. I put like so much energy into this. When this
Yeah.
book comes out, I mean, things are going to change. The
Yeah.
social fabric's going to be rough. It's like nothing happens.
Nothing happens.
Nothing.
And it's funny because, like, I think I've had this experience with other forms of like artistic production that you're like, yeah, whatever. And very much like now with films, I kind of enjoy putting things up because I know, like, I don't give it, like, you might get some nice feedback, you might get somebody on the internet, but mostly no one cares or whatever. But or it's interesting the way things are interpreted, and you couldn't ever have anticipated that. But I think because I have this sort of like doom pilled version of having experienced that, all I have is this like, I hope I don't upset people. Because I know it's like, even if yeah, and I know that, like, especially in film theory, there's this sort of like these holy grails of sort of certain ideas which I do go into, and especially this idea of like gaze and this idea of male gaze, which I think is a really interesting Lacanian concept. And it also is a really slippery one because, as we talked about sexuation, I think that's all really important and stuff. But for me, existential or ontological lack is more politically interesting and important. And
I think
sexuality
that's
is
it.
sensitive with that, and that's also interesting. But I don't think that's where the real juice is. And I also think that the way it's been interpreted has sort of been so. I'm always like, oh God, I sort of like critique that. But at the end of the day, like, whatever. But you also you're a human, so you get nervous about things. So
There you are.
yeah,
Well, everyone, this has been Helen Rollins and a discussion about her newest book, Psychocinema. There'll be links in the descriptions to Helen Rollins' website as well as a link to the book itself. I highly recommend checking that out. And for everyone who's been listening to us this entire time, thanks for listening and have a great evening. The third Philosophy Portal anthology, Logic for the Global Brain, is now available. To pick up a copy, visit philosophyportal.online. The next Philosophy Portal course focuses on the concept and the tradition of Christian atheism. The course starts October 20th, and more information can be found at philosophyportal.online. Throughout the course, we will be developing themes of modern philosophy in relationship to the project of Christian atheism, including German idealism, Hegelo-Marxism, Nietzsche and psychoanalysis, Althusser's gospel, Zizek's philosophy, and Rollins' theology. The course will also feature guest lectures from Slavoj Žižek, Peter Rollins, and Barry Taylor. To learn more, visit philosophyportal.online. Starting in 2024, Philosophy Portal opened The Portal, a live event space dedicated to making philosophy actual. Every month we host 4 events organized under a common theme, designed to build different discursive spaces, to learn concepts, explore the edge of thinking, learn from thought leaders, and get personal about our intellectual journeys. Members get access to a living thinking community and access to the entire history of events, as well as discounts on recorded and future courses. Couples are very much encouraged and get a 2-for-1 discount. To learn more, visit philosophyportal.online and consider becoming a member today. The Portal, the work of the concept.